Welcome everyone to AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday, part of AURI Connects monthly online series, featuring updates on the work AURI is doing to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. I'm Dan Scogan, the AURI Director of Government Relations, and your host on Webinar Wednesdays. The AURI Connects program is hosted by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute in Minnesota. This program aims to actively engage all participants in the food and ag industry to improve competitiveness of producers, businesses, and entrepreneurs through ongoing, purposeful connection of resources and partners along the value chain, and increased knowledge of opportunities, technologies, and trends. Remember that this event is being recorded and archived and can be found at auri.org. Today we'll be hearing from Ariel Kagan, a strategy and innovation specialist with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, where she focuses on domestic markets, business development, and sustainable food systems. Ariel is a resource economist with a background in agricultural policy, fisheries supply chains, sustainability, and agriculture innovation. She has a master's degree in food and resource economics from the University of British Columbia. Prior to coming to MDA, she was a senior program associate at the Food Institute of the George Washington University. Ariel's topic today will be a landscape view of the Minnesota Halal and Kosher Meat Market, a project funded through the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and AURI with contributions from the University of Minnesota's Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships. Remember, you are and will remain muted, but Ariel will be answering questions at the end of her presentation. So send us your questions through the Q&A portal, and we'll be asking the questions at the end of the presentation. And with that, Ariel Kagan, welcome to AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's really great to be here, and I want to thank you for hosting this conversation. I'd like to start by acknowledging that right now we're having some deep conversations about racial equity in our state and across the nation, and something that I'm really proud of with this work that we did last summer was that beyond just sort of getting a sense of the numbers and data in this market, we spent a lot of time building community and relationships with new communities in our state that maybe haven't been a part of the agricultural conversation. So I think that this is a really opportune moment to have this dialogue and to elevate these issues. So just a little bit of background about the study. It was funded through Minnesota Department of Agriculture as well as AURI. And it was an open request for proposals with a 6-month timeline. The scope was a market assessment for halal and kosher meat in Minnesota to get a better understanding of what the barriers were for growth in this market and what the needs were of the communities. So there was a team from the University of Minnesota Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, as well as the Sustainable Farming Association, Extension Services of U of M, and MDA that came together to work on this over the course of most of last summer into fall. The project team was extensive, and we really benefited from the diversity that we had in the project team. This is sort of the key players, but the whole research team was over 25 individuals from every corner of the state and representing a number of different fields of expertise and community relationships and backgrounds. We really benefited from having a multidisciplinary approach to this project that gave us a more expansive understanding of the market than just a simple economic lens. Here's just some of the project team. We visited Chickenhead Farm in Silver Lake, Minnesota last summer. Here's Mohammed Gabani as the farmer who owns Chickenhead Farm, and he processes goats in a halal way on his farm for the local market. We were able to bring a group of community partners from St. Cloud who are interested in growing the halal market in their region, as well as members from Extension and the university to sort of explore his farm, see some processing in action, and then have a really great community dialogue afterwards at a cafe. One thing that was really important to us in this research was that we approached the methodology in a way that had deep respect for these cultural practices. Halal and kosher are faith practices, and so that means that they're very personal, both to an individual as well as to communities. So we spent quite a while developing the methodology, grounded in ethical research methods with respect for persons concerned for welfare and justice as core pillars of every interaction that we had with our research participants. We used a mixed method approach to data collection because we believed that that was an important way to make sure that our interactions were culturally appropriate and that we were meeting people where they were comfortable. So we had a collection of online survey tools as well as one-on-one conversations. We had focus groups and phone calls. We really used a variety of ways to get people's experiences into this report. Of course, that also does mean that the limitations of this study is that it only reflects the opinions of the people that we talk to. So there's a variety of different individual and community understandings of halal and kosher practices, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But what was important to us was to understand that each participant had their perspective that was, worthy and equal to others, and we wanted to include all of that into this report. Overall, we talked to over 100 people in the course of just about 5 months. And for a lot of those people, it was the first time that they had ever interacted with any of these more traditional agricultural institutions like MDA or AURI or SFA. That was really important. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what's happening now. But a lot of those relationships have continued through past the study period and built a framework that we're still working together through. So I'll spend a little bit of time today talking about what is halal and what is kosher. These are, again, faith practices that are, in some cases, thousands of years old. So this won't be sort of a dissertation on all of the nuances. I'm certainly not qualified, and there's a diversity of opinion about all of these different parameters of what these practices entail. But for the most part, both halal and kosher as words mean permissible or what is allowed. And these are faith practices, halal being a faith practice of Islam, kosher being a faith practice of Judaism. So in halal, we're talking about pretty much, and this is actually, so it's true for kosher too, that it can pertain to anything in your life. What we're going to talk about today is meat. That's one very narrow part of halal or kosher markets that can extend to personal care products, other types of foods, financing, the way that you set up your home, the way that you have relationships with each other. So it's a very broad term. And in this very specific report, we were just looking at meat, which very much narrows it. But if you have a conversation with somebody about halal or kosher practices, it will be much more expansive. So eating halal is a core pillar of Islam. And to be halal meat, the animal must be a halal animal. And it also must be slaughtered in a halal manner, which is called zabiha. So a halal animal there are different sort of criteria, but the main part in a Western diet is the exclusion of hogs from the list of animals that are halal. There are also some practices related to the raising of the animal that can make it not halal, and that can include any medicine that would have any sort of pork or alcoholic factors in it, because those are both haram, which is not permissible. So to be slaughtered, zabiha, in a halal manner, the animal must be prayed over as the slaughter occurs. And that's really the key piece that separates this from a more conventional approach to animal slaughter. There are a ton of different criteria that may or may not be involved in a halal slaughter process, depending on the community that you're working with and the certification agency that is overseeing this. There are many, many different certifications, and each one of them have a slightly different approach to what they're looking for a zabiha slaughter. I've listed in the photos here just 3 that are active in the United States, and there are dozens, if not hundreds, that are available. The top one there, IFANCA, the Islamic Food and Nutrition Council of America, is the largest one in the United States, and has export arrangements with countries that only import halal meats, but there are other certification bodies that are more localized. Some of those criteria can include the animal must be facing Mecca, criteria around who the slaughterer is, so if that person needs to be a Muslim or if they can be any observant Christian or Jew or otherwise. They can also have criteria about where the other animals are in waiting for the slaughter process. And a big piece that comes up often with halal slaughter is the issue of live slaughter, so slaughter without stunning beforehand, and that is fairly expected by consumers that halal meat would have been slaughtered live without stunning. However, there's quite a bit of nuance in that when it actually comes to the processing, and we found that the consumer expectation about that versus what is actually in the market, there's kind of a disconnect there, and that can be a very sensitive issue because, again, it has to do with values and expectations and faith practices. So it's really important to understand what the community expectations are and what the certification guidelines are to ensure that there's sort of transparency between those things and that they're matching up. There's a little bit more nuance on the halal side about live slaughter than there is with kosher, and I'll get to that. There's been quite a lot of research done about whether or not stunning that is reversible is permissible in halal, and again, it depends on the community that you're working with. So kosher is, again, a faith practice of Judaism. While it's similar to halal, these are distinct practices and obviously have very different markets associated with these certifications. So kosher has a slightly more rigid set of standards and certifications, and there's a lot of really interesting history to why that might be, mostly having to do with the idea that for Jewish people, they've been living in diaspora longer and have had to sort of figure out what exactly this kosher standard for meat is. There are a number, again, of certification agencies around the world. In the United States, the Orthodox Union is the largest certifier, and they have very clear standards when it comes to what is and is not kosher. Kosher standards also have a slightly higher or different threshold in terms of what a kosher animal is. So for kosher, the animal must have cloven hooves and chew its cud. So again, hogs are going to be excluded from that list, but there are other animals too, like horses and camel, that are not kosher. Camel can be halal. So that's just an example of how this is a complicated landscape, and it takes some time to understand exactly what the criteria are for each of these markets. In the case of kosher, again, there's a stronger definition around who the slaughterer can be, and that person has to be a trained kosher slaughterer, which in Hebrew is called a shochet, and that is a person who's been trained in the rules and methods of kosher slaughter. So again, that's one of the key differences between halal and kosher in terms of the slaughter process, and then plays out in how these markets are developed in Minnesota. In kosher meat processing, stunning is absolutely not allowed. There, at least in our research, we didn't find any certifications that allowed for stunning ahead of time. And then there's some after slaughter processing that is also required for kosher. First of all, as many people may know, it's only the sort of front half of the animal is kosher and the back half is not kosher. So that back half needs to have a secondary market. We sort of affectionately called that in the research the secular market for meat that hind end would go to. And any kosher meat that's going to go into the kosher supply chain needs to also be drained of blood by salting and soaking before any further processing. So in terms of equipment in a processing facility, you need additional infrastructure like soaking vats, water, and wastewater treatment. So processing for halal and kosher requires some additional steps from a regulatory perspective. So I want to be really clear that live slaughter is one of the 2 protected and legal ways to slaughter animals in the United States under the Humane Handling Act of 1958. And even though a lot of the forms that are associated with live slaughter use the word exemption, they're not being exempted from any humane handling practices. Any meat inspector who sees any inhumane practices in a kosher or halal processing facility still must report that and handle that, and all of the same standards related to animal welfare are required. The only difference is that the stunning, the animal is rendered senseless either by stunning in a conventional processing facility or by a quick cut to the neck in a halal or kosher facility. But these are legal and humane, and that's something that I think the word exemption gets used in a very technical way that sometimes isn't entirely understood by the general public. To get that ritual exemption to utilize live slaughter for Minnesota Department of Agriculture Equal II plants, which are our state inspected plants, there's simply a form that's on the right side of your screen, and the religious authority would just fill this out in partnership with the processing facility. They have to list who the person performing the slaughter is going to be, and they have to sort of explain what they're going to do. And this is more just like any other change that you would make to a meat processing facility, whether you're going to change the line speed or the height of your equipment. You just have to document it because the inspectors are in there making sure that you're following the plan and that things are going according to plan. So this is just a way to get it on paper that you have a sense of what you need to do this ritual slaughter. For USDA inspected plants, it's a similar process. There's a checkbox on the grant of inspection form, and that just that says you're going to do kosher or halal processing. You have to provide the name of the slaughterer again, and the USDA inspectors will process that form and make sure that all of the other steps that they would need on their end are completed. There's also the possibility of custom exempt halal or kosher slaughter, which is something that came up quite a bit, but we didn't dive into in the report because we were mostly looking at retail and wholesale meats, and custom exempt meat processing is only for not for sale meat. So an animal that you own as a person and you take to a custom exempt plant and you get the meat back for that. So that's a little bit different, but we do see quite a lot of halal processing in Minnesota happening through custom exempt plants where the customer buys the live animal from a farmer, takes it to a custom exempt processor, and works with the custom exempt processor to either perform the slaughter themselves or direct the processor in how to do the slaughter to their standards. So what is the kosher market in Minnesota? We went into this in the report, sort of looking at these markets on an equal playing field. And the fact is that the kosher market in Minnesota is quite small. We have a fairly small Jewish population in Minnesota to begin with. It's around 45,000 people. And not all Jews keep kosher, and actually more and more are sort of dropping that from their practice. There are also people who look for kosher foods that are not Jewish, and maybe some of the listeners have themselves looked for kosher hot dogs when you're either in the store or at the ballpark, because there's sort of this idea that kosher hot dogs and other kosher products may be of a higher quality or a better taste, some sort of preference that's not based in faith, but based in a different attribute. One reason that some Jewish people in Minnesota have dropped the certification from their practice is because they want to have other attributes associated with their meat. So there's a deep interest in organic or animal and labor welfare options that are they're not in the market, or they're very expensive. So I talked to one person who doesn't eat meat other than at big family gatherings, and her family feels strongly about kosher certification. So she ordered her Thanksgiving turkey online from an organic producer and paid over $150 for that turkey. So definitely not an everyday expense that many families want to make. And sometimes other labels like organic fill that need that folks are looking for from that sort of ethical or faith practice perspective. So there's a variety of different approaches to that. Another interesting thing that's happening in the market that we didn't address directly in this report, but would be an area of future research, is that the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger, I believe both have been certified as kosher. And we did talk to at least 2 people who had stopped eating meat because they couldn't find kosher meat that met their criteria, and then now had added those alternative meat products back into their diet in the place of meat where that would have been before. So it's an interesting trend that may grow in the future. The halal market in Minnesota is a much bigger market. We have about 150,000 Muslims in Minnesota, and it's a very diverse segment. So I know a lot of people immediately think of our Somali immigrant population when they think of this market, and they're the largest subsector of that 150,000. There are about 42,000 Somali people living in Minnesota, but that leaves quite a lot of other folks who are looking for halal food who are not of that background. So very diverse segment, different needs, different culinary traditions. And so it's an exciting opportunity to think about how many different business ventures could be grown in this sector. The highest demand that we found was for goat, beef, and some chicken. And right now, most halal red meat is being imported from Australia or New Zealand. And that's particularly true for goat. It's brought in these large boxes that you see in the photo here, and then it's sort of further processed by the retailers and sold either by the pound or in different cuts in bags. There is a huge desire for fresh goat meat within the Somali population especially, and more broadly for fresh and local, and again, those sustainable options that people are looking for in the meat aisle are sort of missing in this sector. There's also a big value added opportunity here. We saw, especially with first, second, third generation Muslim immigrant communities, their kids have grown up eating pizza rolls and frozen burritos, and they want to have those foods with halal meat. So there's a great business in Minneapolis. If you are local, you can look for it in the store, called Football Pizza, and it's a pizza in the shape of a football, and it's made with halal pepperoni, and it's been a very successful venture because it's filling that need for sort of Western style food with halal meat and attributes. So here are just some photos from St. Cloud of how this goat meat specifically is coming in to these small scale ethnic grocery stores. So it comes in the full, carcass form. They have the equipment that they need to cut it down into cubes, which is sort of, the preference for most Somali women who are buying and cooking this food. It's sold by the pound, but there's not a lot of customer choice in that. We heard a lot of people saying that they prefer to have fresh cuts that they could sort of select and have more choice in. And again, this is all coming from Australia and New Zealand, very long supply chains. The meat has been frozen for quite a while. There were quite a lot of comments about the taste and flavor of the meat. And there are also some issues about that certification with stunning. We know that in New Zealand, all the meat is stunned before the slaughter happens, and that's where that customer expectation is maybe not being met. So I do want to just touch on that issue of sustainability. This was an important part of a lot of the conversations that we had, both with halal and kosher consumers, as well as with farmers who are interested in getting into this market. So we know that we have a lot of farmers who either have recently introduced small ruminants onto their land, like goats and sheep, who are looking for markets, or also farmers who know that livestock could be an important part of their farm if they had a market for it. So in the kosher realm, there is this idea of Magen Tzedek, which is a justice certification that was developed by actually a Minnesota rabbi in response to some of the labor welfare and animal welfare issues that came out of some news and events in Iowa. And this certification fulfills all the needs of a kosher process while also including additional attributes for labor, animal welfare, and environmental impact. On the halal side, there's a concept called tayyib halal, and that means sort of wholesomeness, which then is more expansive beyond those traditional halal requirements around animal welfare and environmental concerns. So what I think is exciting about this is that you can see where those values overlap between the farmers who are trying to steward their land in a new way with ruminants and building up soil health, and then consumers who are looking for value-based products in the market with halal and kosher processing. So some of the takeaways, I certainly invite you all to take a look at the report. The report goes into much more depth than I was able to go into today on all these different topics. The report URL is at the bottom of the screen there. The main message I'd like everybody to take away from this is that there's no one size fits all. Nobody can say this is what halal meat is or this is what kosher meat is. These are complex and diverse practices, and that's part of the sort of excitement about working in this field. There is an unmet demand, particularly for fresh and sustainable halal meat, especially in Minnesota, but also for kosher. Overall, we can't really talk about the unmet demand for halal and kosher meat without also talking about the shortage of small to mid-sized meat processing in the state, and especially for small to mid-sized animals. And anybody who's been paying attention to the news recently, obviously we're having a pretty severe conversation about meat processing both in the state and across the country. So it'll be interesting to see where that conversation goes, and if we can see investments in these small to mid-sized meat processors that would be more able to include halal or kosher practices in their facilities. We also have a lack of a developed market for sheep and goats in Minnesota. We have a few auction yards, and that's about it other than direct contracting, and that makes it a really hard market for farmers to access. So there needs to be some more work done on developing that market for sheep and goats in Minnesota. And then, you know, as I sort of said at the beginning, I think the most important part of all of this work is that it really highlights that food can be and should be a part of community and economic development strategies, and that this is something that can really bring communities together and build some cohesion and some strong linkages and build wealth within these communities that's based in justice. And I think that's a really key thing that we should all be thinking about right now. And also, as I said, this report and the work that this kicked off has led to a number of other conversations around the state about how to meet this demand. And right now there's a group of us from Extension as well as from the Muslim population in St. Cloud talking about how to create perhaps a local halal certification for Minnesota, starting up a new meat processing facility that would only do halal, that would be sort of community owned, and setting up a series of extension courses for farmers to understand this market from sort of a a ground level, how to change your farm to access this market. So lots still coming, and it's an exciting time. So thank you again so much for this opportunity. I hope that this was helpful, and I look forward to questions.
Well, thank you, Ariel. And I think your fourth bullet point there may be directed toward our first question of the day. It says here that we raise hairy sheep, the catadin, for meat, and we're looking for a market. We live near Austin, Minnesota. My specific question for the presenter is, how can we market or sell our meat? We have about 25 ewes and would like to expand to about 200 ewes, but first we need to find a market to sell them. And we have not had much luck finding a market. We currently sell them to the sale barn, and we could easily certify the sheep as organic if that would help. We don't treat them with antibiotics, and they only eat our pasture and bales, and our farm fields are 100% certified organic or in transition right now. And of course, they are pasture raised except in the winter when they use their own hay that comes from their own organic or in transition fields. So talk a little bit more about the development of a market for the sheep and goats. What were some takeaways from this study there?
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest, our big finding, which is not surprising to any goat or sheep farmers, is that it's very hard to find that market. And what it comes down to, I think, for a lot of people is just building relationships with communities that are looking for goat and sheep meat. So that means sort of showing up to any public events that your local Islamic center might be holding, or that the mosque might have days where you can have a community dinner. And obviously this is all much harder during COVID when we're all sort of staying home to build those relationships. But the farmers that have had the most success with this have invested time in building relationships with those communities. And there are a couple of businesses that are operating as sort of middlemen in that area. So one is Zabiha Fresh Meat, which is based out of Rochester. And the man who owns that, he buys from local farmers on contracts or directly, and has an arrangement with the USDA processor to do halal processing of those animals, and then sends that into the Twin Cities market. So, it's tough because it's not just, make the product and it'll sell. It's really dependent on relationships. And we'll see, with this development in St. Cloud, if that project gets off the ground, if they become sort of a central buyer for small ruminants, I think that would be a real game changer for the sheep and goat market in Minnesota.
Do you want to remind anyone who's listening today that we do have a Q&A or a question and answer portal that's available? You can certainly ask your questions. Ariel, it says here, in 1986, I was one of the state's first recognized halal certifiers. In 2001, with the support of the Jewish community, I helped draft and provide expert testimony before the Minnesota legislature to bring the halal bill into law. Is there any interest on the part of some of Minnesota's, mainly poultry, meat producers, regarding adding halal product lines for sale to the general public through major grocery stores?
Yeah, it's a great question, and sounds like the person who asked that has a lot of experience in this. I think that there is and there will be a growing interest in sort of halal meats in those conventional grocery establishments. We're seeing that, and I should say from both the Muslim or halal eating population, as well as non-halal consumers. So in New York City, we saw a number of businesses that have started recently that are doing that sort of tayyib halal, organic and animal welfare plus halal business operations, and they're finding that most of their consumers are actually not Muslim. So I think that, again, as we're going through this moment where a lot of people are thinking about where their meat's coming from for the first time, these certifications and practices have interest outside of the faith communities. So I can definitely see an interest in having that more conventional retail landscape. And it always just comes back to processing capacity. So as the listener probably knows, Minnesota has a huge shortage of poultry processing, and we keep on losing them. I think we've lost 2 already this year. So we really do need to get a handle on our meat processing in the state if we're going to be able to have any sort of innovation that would include things like halal and kosher meat. I also wanted to add, and I should have included this in the general portion, but something that's really important for people to know in terms of what is the state's role is that the First Amendment makes it really, it's I don't even want to use the word difficult because it's the First Amendment and it's an important point, but it makes it difficult to have any sort of policy development around faith practices because of that separation of church and state. And so any sort of definition of what a halal process is needs to always be defined by and regulated by the faith communities themselves. So as the person who asked the question knows, what we have in statute around halal and kosher labeling in the Minnesota statutes are entirely based on delegated authority to religious authorities to define what those practices are. But we do have laws that protect the labeling. So if you mislabel a product, you can file a complaint about that, but defining the practices is not the role that the state will ever take.
Well, that makes me wonder, is processing halal and kosher training available?
Yes. So within the faith communities, there are many different ways that people can become trained in those processing practices. At the state level, within our meat inspection division, every inspector is given training on these ritual slaughter practices, so they know what to look for. And I think as we develop this project in St. Cloud or in other places around the state, certainly workforce development is a big part of the general meat processing capacity issue. And I know that we have a lot of people who are already working in meat processing with these skills that are also Muslim and may have interest in working in a halal meat processing facility. So I think there's some exciting opportunities there for using the skills that we already have in our population in Minnesota to meet the demands of these communities.
Is it possible to raise halal kosher animals on the same premises as non-halal and kosher animals? Then they add, I'm guessing there would be at least a separation needed of some sort.
Yep. Yeah. So this gets into sort of each specific community has different expectations around what that would look like. Obviously, you would want to have records about which animal is which if you're doing any, veterinary care that might include haram or non-kosher additives. In terms of actual hogs on the farm, there would certainly be an expectation that the hogs are kept separate from any other animals, which I think is fairly standard procedure anyways. Having worked on a farm with about 100 hogs, I don't think we would have ever let them out into the broader pasture, but they weren't always the friendliest to the other animals. But yes, other communities would expect that there would be no hogs on that farm. So that's that gets into the really understanding who you're serving, and that's true for processing and slaughterhouse facilities in general, is that sometimes it's okay to process hogs in the same facility if it's on a different day or if there's a very deep cleaning between those activities. Other communities would say absolutely not. There should never be any hogs in the facility. So it really just comes down to having really clear and open expectations with your customers.
And that's back to developing those relationships with how you do business and what the expectations might be from the customer.
Yes, exactly.
We do kind of a follow-up question to that, though. I think you touched on it. Can non-halal and kosher processing take place in the same facility, specifically in a custom processing facility? And did you say that that comes down to the customer?
Yeah, so I think I can give a more confident answer that yes, you can do non-halal or non-kosher processing in the same facility as long as you're not, I think the big caveat is hogs. So certainly, switching between live slaughter and conventional slaughter of goats wouldn't likely be an issue. But if you're switching between halal goats and then hogs, that would be where that issue would be. But certainly our USDA plants and Equal 2 plants that have these practices, they do serve both markets.
You did several bullet points on takeaways from the report, but as a wrap up or a final question, are there any obvious next steps that producers, processors, extension people should be thinking about taking? Is there something that really jumps out at you, Ariel?
Yeah, I mean, one is if you're really interested in this, please do get in touch because we're pulling together some key stakeholders right now to develop this programming through extension that would be a continued education opportunity around halal specifically. If you're just generally interested in learning more, I really recommend just doing some reading. There's so much information online about this, and there's been some really interesting work out of Cornell, and Temple Grandin has done quite a bit of work on this. It's a fascinating sector to learn more about, and there's a lot to read, and our work cited in the report is a good place to start to learn more about this very diverse market opportunity.
Well, Ariel Kagan, we want to thank you for your time today and for participating on our AURI Connects webinar Wednesday. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
And that will conclude AURI Connects webinar Wednesday for today, presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. AURI's mission is to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. Are you gluten sensitive or do you have digestibility issues when consuming wheat products? Research indicates that gluten protein and anti-nutrients found in wheat can trigger irritable bowel syndrome in individuals. Efforts to reduce the discomforts resulting from the consumption of wheat-based products is critical in improving the health of consumers and increasing the profitability of wheat farmers. The long-term goal of this research is to reduce wheat sensitivity through the identification of wheat varieties with a naturally low anti-nutrient level and genetic variations of FODMAPs for breeding purposes, and to explore fermentation as a processing technique to reduce FODMAPs in wheat food products. Please join University of Minnesota project researchers Dr. Jim Anderson and Dr. George Anor as they discuss findings to date in this multi-year research project, which is funded through the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Growth Research and Innovation, or AURI grant. Join us on July 8th from noon till 1. You can register right now at auri.org/webinar-Wednesday. We are also interested in your feedback on our webinar Wednesday, so please respond when we send you an event evaluation. Thank you for participating today, and remember, for more information on today's topic or any of the work that AURI is involved with, you can go to auri.org and join us again on July 8th for another AURI Connects webinar Wednesday.